Hello, hello.
Hey there. Nice to see you.
Great to finally meet you.
Yeah, we've done.
Yeah, thank you so much for making the time for this conversation.
My
It's
pleasure.
really great. You've been following the space, I think, much longer before it has piqued the public's attention. I started really looking into it when Midjourney first came out in Dali, like the summer last year,
Yeah,
and I went down that rabbit hole. Before, AI was always something that was continuously talked about when I was a child, and it was always about to happen, but it never really happened. And it seemed as if it had been brewing in the background, and now all of a sudden people are needing to face it
yeah,
rather rapidly.
yeah,
It's really about the philosophical questions that AI raises, especially when it comes to generative tech and our understanding what it means to be human, what it means to think, because I think there are very profound implications. And the question we should be asking ourselves is what kind of world we want to live in and what is the role of AI in it. For me personally, I see this generative text technology like ChatGPT with tremendous possibility, benefit, but also tremendous possibility of disaster, and both are like equally possible.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's exciting time to be alive, even if we ignore all of the geopolitical events happening in our world. From a technological perspective, it can be daunting for anyone going into pretty much any field these days from a knowledge worker perspective, but also with robotics on the rise, with Tesla and Elon working on their new humanoid robot, and with things like autopilot and full self-driving entering vehicle fleets, it looks like there's really going to be no realm of labor on the planet that goes untouched. And through a capitalist lens, that can be really frightening because a low-cost provider always wins out in a capitalist society. And it takes the introduction of civil society superimposing values on top of that with things like socialized medicine or healthcare or education to balance that out. So I think we'll see a lot of change in our world, not only in fields like education, but I think that change has the power to unlock a lot of human potential that's been stagnant. But through the traditional lens of media, fear is what people lead with. If it bleeds, it leads in the traditional sense of media. So that fear is very close to the surface, but it doesn't take much to transform it into excitement. I think excitement and fear are on the same continuum. And if we can move through fear, it's often very empowering to get to excitement or passion. Just a simple example on the media, generative AI, GPT is the specific example that's getting the most attention. A lot of teachers are really scratching their heads going, how do I know if my student has really done the work or if they've just typed in something and generated a paper or a novel or what have you? But they tend to ignore the fact that teachers are equally, if not more, empowered by this, because a teaching relationship is usually a one-to-many relationship, where even if it was a one-to-one relationship, it would still be empowering. But one-to-many situation where I might have 20 or 30 students in a pod or 200 students in a lecture, if I'm teaching at someplace like MIT in an intro to computer science lecture, the ability to utilize these tools in order to really help wade through the tons of coursework that comes back on a regular basis, it can reduce the burnout for any instructor. And not only that, but if it's used appropriately, it gives the instructor the ability to address the individual needs of each student. And we all know that every student has a different modality of learning that they do best with, whether they're visual or auditory or have different ways of looking at the world. A pre-trained transformer. And by the way, the pre-trained aspect of it is that GPT and other systems or model are trained on what's called a corpus. So when they're interacting with a student or a user, they're balancing and weighting the corpus, which in GPT's case is, I think, there's 175 billion different parameters that it's scoured and weighted in the form of what's called a token. And those tokens are generated from web content mostly, but they're also trained and weighted by humans who are going through and taking a task-oriented view of the data and saying, okay, if somebody is asking about something in an instruction setting, this is the type of pedagogy, or you can think of it as like a template for generating a response that is most effective. If they're looking for a news summary or something like that, this is the type of thing to do. GPT has, as I say, about 175 billion variables or arguments that it balances in that. but there are systems coming. That was GPT-3, ChatGPT, which is based on GPT 3.5, has an order of magnitude or more. Very quickly, these systems are essentially losing all of the friction that we're used to when we talk to Siri or when we talk to Alexa or something like that, because they often the systems know more about us than we know about ourselves. Or if not about us, they can very quickly fit us into one of their algorithmic archetypes of what type of user is this, what type of thing are they looking to accomplish. And new systems that are emerging very soon, coming from companies like Google, have many different
Bard,
models.
you mean? Bard?
Yeah, Bard. Yeah, that Bard is the latest name that they're using. There are all kinds of AI projects inside of Google. And what they're doing is they're trying to roll all these various models into one presentation layer for the user. So you could ask a very complicated question like, outline for me an ideal course of study and reading if my goal is to be an expert in this topic. However, do it from the perspective of a West African and of this socioeconomic class. And that's called prompt engineering. The idea is input, output. The prompt is what you ask for, and that's the input, and the output is what is given back to you, or is essentially predicted to be what you're looking for. And that's what these systems do. They predict what's the next word that comes out, what's the next module of content, what's the next topic of discussion, et cetera.
So there are two things here that I found very striking when playing around with these technologies. One was prompt engineering itself, the new modality of thinking for human brains. It's thinking about thinking, like how you tell someone to think about something, like it's something we're not used to.
It's not. And there's an old saying that the poison and the medicine are the same. It's just about dosage, right? Our society for the last decade or two, or some might argue for the last 200 years, has been controlled and channeled by media, right? It's been very much a divide and conquer approach that is used to rule the masses. And so we see that in our political system, where despite the fact that we're living in the 21st century, there's only two political parties that have any real clout. And they often say the left wing and the right wings are the same turkey, right? Which is ironic if you look at a country like America, where supposedly our highest value is freedom, right? And freedom is essentially choice. It's conceivable that you can't really have choice unless it's an informed choice, right? You can't really have a sense of freedom unless you know what your options are, right? Otherwise, you're just like a rat in a maze. And from an input, output, artificial intelligence, sentience perspective, the idea that we need to understand the range of choices that we're giving the computer, we need to be able to clearly articulate what it is that we are wanting to discuss or to co-create with the system. That is really medicine for a sick society. And it's very powerful. In fact, people can play around with this themselves. If you go into something like OpenAI's ChatGPT, you can ask it to give you something. You can cut and paste a transcript from a YouTube video, like for example, Biden's recent State of the Union, and you can ask it to summarize that. You can then ask it to summarize it from a libertarian perspective. And what you do is you just say, summarize this for me in the voice of, and then you can do that. You can give multiple parameters. You could say, summarize this for me in the voice of Thomas Jefferson meets Buckminster Fuller. And so because the algorithm is pre-trained on essentially the entire internet up through 2021, it has reduced all of the thinking and all of the available output and text for every single one of those perspectives into essentially a mathematical weighting or formula. It's tokenized the writings of Thomas Jefferson into mathematical formulas. And so that's liberating. And it's powerful, but it's also got, like any tool, it's powerful to be misused as well.
I also think a generation that grows up with this will have a totally different understanding of consciousness, thinking, and subjectivity. It will understand thinking and sense making as something independent of consciousness, maybe.
Yeah,
possibly, because it forces, like evolutionarily, I think it could bring people to a different level of metacognition, and where thinking about thinking becomes more of a normal thing, which is
hopefully.
Right now isn't. Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, from a critical thinking perspective, it's necessary. That's what's missing in our society right now is critical thinking. And it's by design. That I think it's a cartoon or something that is like the king and his jester looking out over the masses, and they have the torches and the pitchforks, and the jester says, you don't need to fight them all. You just need to convince the ones with the pitchforks that the ones with the torches want to take their pitchforks away. It's classic divide and conquer. And so this is very much a prosthesis for augmenting our thinking. And it's not only a sort of left brain rational tool set, because, that's one way of looking at thinking, but it's also because it literally has access to the entirety of digitized human knowledge. There are a bunch of parameters that these systems are driven by. One of them is something called temperature. And temperature, if you raise the temperature, it basically makes broader leaps, right? And another one is perplexity. If you raise or lower the perplexity, you increase or decrease the amount of repetition. A very low perplexity document would read like a Wall Street Journal. A very high perplexity output would read more like a Wired magazine or something like that. So you can shift these tones. And so it's in order to use the tool, especially as an artist or a creative person, you need to master your tool. Every art is essentially reduced to the constraints and limitations of the media in which it is practiced. So that's very similar.
On a more critical note, one could also argue that in a way, now as an example, ChatGPT is parroting back knowledge that it found on the web with all its biases, all its limitations to us. And there are lots of cases where even simple facts are represented in a way that is incorrect. There's no way for us to at some point check where this information comes from, how it comes to this conclusion. And
that will change very quickly. That's already starting to change. Yeah. There's what's called attention algorithms. And what that does is essentially by fine tuning the attention algorithm, you allow the system to understand what your intention is and where it should place its attention. So the reason that you get those sort of misfires in terms of it giving you the wrong data is that right now, ChatGPT, which is the system that grew to like over 1 million users in like less than 10 weeks or something like that. Google recently declared a code red because they were seeing an impact on their search traffic, right? They were seeing that given the choice of entering something and having to surf through tons of links that are just sponsorships and then other things. It used to be, I don't know if you remember this, but I used to work for a company called Digital Equipment Corporation that created the first commercial search engine called Alta Vista. And back then, the web was so small that you could type in a phrase that you had in an article or a paper, and it would find the exact document in every instance of that on the web, which wasn't a lot compared to now. But these days, you can type in an exact phrase from something, and Google just won't find it. It's very obvious that Google has shifted, or at least up until now, has shifted their focus from actually finding to searching and monetizing that search, right? And that's a short-sightedness that caused the founders to come back and shift their focus to this BARD project. And so I guess where I was going with that is that the current mechanism behind ChatGPT is serving millions, if not tens of millions or hundreds of millions by now, users on very constrained resources per user. So you really only get about what's called about a 500 to a 2000, depending on the system load, token window. And there are different algorithms. One of them is called a long short-term memory, LSTM. And that's a different approach. Defaults to a lower attention mechanism and algorithm when it has less CPU resources.
Saying these factual errors are not part of a design flaw, they're children maladies that will be ironed out soon enough, so to say?
Yeah. They're artifacts. In fact, you can do this. You can ask it to give you a quote on something, and you can get excited because it'll look at the conversational context of whatever you've been working on, whether it's a positioning paper or an article or a section of your thesis, and it'll give you an ideal, amazing quote. But then if you go type that exact quote into another search engine, you can't find it. So it's essentially made up the quote. And that's the artifact of the system predicting what the next word is, as opposed to handing off that to a separate, and that's probably already gone away in GPT-4. I'm sure there's a model that's designed specifically for retrieving quotes. Yeah.
Because to the average tech interested kind of wide reader, right? If you would have told them about ChatGPT 2 years ago, for example, they would have said, oh, creativity, that's the last thing AI will ever do. We're going to have self-driving Tesla cars much earlier than that. And now, just before some months ago, I read an article, Tesla in these lawsuits about their claims about self-driving capability that in the end could not really hold up, said that it was an aspiration to have the self-driving capabilities. It didn't really pan out. And we seem to be further away from the idea that AI systems decide over life and death in driving situations. And it's more kind of the spirited artist application that seems to be closer to our reality now. It's very weird. It seems to have an unexpected twist here. at least
Yeah.
for the uninformed person, right?
Certainly for the uninformed person, it's an unexpected twist. And the idea of creativity is so subjective. Really, creativity is a balance of appropriateness combined with a sense of novelty, right? When somebody pierces the boundaries of what's expected, it's like they say that humor is tragedy plus time. It's the unexpected plus time to recover. That's why GPT is still, and other transformers are still mastering humor, because they're developing a sense of context because when you have the entire written internet or web as your context, it can be very challenging to decide where is that border between expected and unexpected. And that's where pre-training and fine-tuning, using humans to augment that process, combined with setting the attention of what it is that you're talking about or what it is that you're trying to create. But it'll get better and better. And we're seeing it first in text to image. We started out with GPT 2 and 3, which were the first ones that were really publicly understood as text prompting. And then we very quickly in October of last year, 2022, moved with DALL-E and Midjourney to text to image, right? But we're still in that case where even the text to image models are really drawing upon just the art that they have access to, which is a very small amount in the greater scheme of things, but will very quickly change. But as we move into text to video and video to video, and Meta made an announcement at the end of last year about their Make a Video. I don't know if you've played with it. It looks almost like a cartoon, really. And it's, in some sense, it's like creating images and interpolating between them. But where we're going is really video to video. And there's a company called runway.ml, that has a set of tools now where you could take this video, right? And it could parse that video, and we could say, turn it into a cartoon, right? Where both of us become cartoon characters. Or you could superimpose all these books with something else, aquarium full of fish or something like that. As the system starts to combine all of these different modalities, the idea of creativity will grow as well. And at the same time, seemingly in a contradictory fashion, as we add more models, one like Wolfram is working with some of this technology to generate really accurate scientific models. And that's someplace where you don't want to be improvising. You're very rigid in your thinking because it's structured. So we're at the very early days now, which is exciting because really anything is possible from this perspective. But very quickly, we'll get to the point where you really won't know if you're talking to a human. If you're going through video, people can Google something like future tools to see what's coming next. And as these sort of percolate up into the majority of us, it will be very difficult to separate reality from virtual reality or constructed, composed reality.
I've been playing with Midjourney since last summer, and the learning curve has been exponential there in terms of quality output and the hand getting better and all kinds of things. It seems to be that every time somebody uses it, it actually gets better for some reason. Like it actually learns and learns. And the other day I was talking to a friend of mine who works as a strategist at one of the leading advertising companies here in Germany. And he said, yeah, we're trying this thing out because people in the upper floors are getting nervous. And now we have this, the other day I used ChatGPT to actually write a strategy brief for a fast food company that I am in charge of. And the first took me a little bit, but then I remembered this German author that has this very nice way of writing emotionally. And then I combined this memory of the feel and tone of this author. And then it was just perfect all of a sudden. So you had to use a new tone and thinking about the text from a different perspective. And it was fine. He said it did this in 20 seconds and it would be good enough for 60% of our clients.
Yeah.
And that combined with Midjourney does really makes you wonder where the value will be generated. There's this other digital agency, DB, it's this big advertisement agency. It has this hybrid model called RAND. And there you can just pitch in say, okay, I want some creative ideas for a company, and this is the target audience. And it will generate you a creative brief, even with images. And it's pretty good. It's like good enough for half of the video of mid-sized agencies that I've seen the output would be happy to do this within 3 days of work.
Yeah.
So it really begs the question where this is going, right?
It's a great thought exercise that most people aren't aware of, but the horse-drawn wagon was essentially the width of 2 horses. It had to fit 2 horses in front, and the roads weren't that wide. And when the Model T came about, essentially had to be no wider than a wagon, right? Which again is 2 horses. And when we invented trains. They were essentially carrying automobiles and all kinds of other things. So we continue to stay at that width. And later on, when you had something like the space shuttle rocket boosters, there's a direct line of descent from the width of two horses' asses, right? So it doesn't take a lot of creativity to see how the future is informed by the past. Where things get interesting is when you make a state change, when you make a level shift. And that's what we're on the edge of right now. Our relationship with silicon intelligence or artificial intelligence, right now it's viewed through the lens of text to text or text to image or text to video. Speech recognition is there. It just hasn't really been integrated effectively beyond Google and Alexa and Siri. But very soon, like probably by Christmas of next year, we'll be talking to our computers the way Iron Man, Tony Stark, talked to Jarvis, right? We'll have that sort of relationship with it. We might not have the same level of agency when we're flying around and asking to adjust our trim and our turbo boosters, but we'll have that level of interactivity because natural speech is no longer a barrier. What's going to be interesting is when we make the state change or the level shift from this two-dimensional reality where you and I are looking at each other through these two little windows to a three-dimensional reality or an immersive reality. And that's what Facebook's now Meta, Mark Zuckerberg, has been focused on. It's nearly killed the company from a financial perspective to do that kind of lift. But we will get there. In fact, some would say we're already there. It's just not as polished, right? But that represents a shift in our thinking, the likes of which we haven't seen in over 2,000 years. If you think about it, the mechanism that we use in a lecture hall or even an online lecture is one where there is essentially one person, an instructor, or if we're looking through a Netflix window or something, there's 2 or 3 actors on screen at any one point in time. And it's a many to one or a many to few relationship where we're all looking as the audience at the actors. We're about to invert that entire paradigm to the point where when you put on Apple's Reality One virtual reality headset, or when you put on an HTC Vive or something like that, you are now at the center of an entire world. So that sort of inversion is going to require a whole new level of tools in order to avoid the vertigo, the informational vertigo of being overwhelmed by the entire internet. Because it's no longer are you looking at it through a little tiny porthole on your iPad or your cell phone or even your laptop, but you're surrounded by it. And that it's very much a matrix moment.